listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns.
Mattia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast Advertising Playbook here live at South by Southwest. How's your day going?
My pleasure. Amazing. I think that finally podcasting is coming to South by Southwest officially.
Officially. So exciting.
And I hope this is going to be the first year of many, many years when we can expand this presence with multiple years and multiple activities around this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we want to talk a little bit about programmatic advertising today. And for people who are listening who maybe haven't fully grasped the concept of programmatic, I always like to start with that because I feel like it's a little bit trickier. So can you define programmatic ads for us?
Everyone has their own definition.
They do.
I think at the core of this is that is a real-time bidding between multiple demand partners or multiple demand sources. They're trying to buy an ad slot in a very programmatic way using computers. Yeah. So it's very different from what it was in radio. There was very sort of like a baked-in approach, or direct sales, where you actually buy something directly on a show and you don't have to compete with other buyers or potential buyers.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think with programmatic, it's also important for us to say that it typically always needs to be an announcer-read ad, right? Because of the way that the ads are being bought. It typically is not host-read.
No, it's pre-recorded.
Yeah.
However, and this is one of the points that was brought up during a few panels, artificial intelligence can come and help a lot to scale the level and the quality and the differentiation of creatives, which I think is something that we haven't explored much yet. But in the future months, in the next months or next years, I think is something that brands needs to understand how to use that to actually create more compelling and diverse stories without having the burden of like recording each one of those creatives with a real person.
Right. No, I totally agree. I think that it is going to be really fascinating to see, even from a host-read perspective, because the reality is that creating a host-read ad is a lot of work. And so if we can leverage AI to create those ads, you know, it doesn't matter how that ad is being purchased, right?
Absolutely.
There could be a lot of power in it. I think, of course, we all get a little nervous, though, because then what does that mean? Like, is the host really endorsing the product? Really like it? I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think consent.
Sure.
Number one. Number two, you have to represent the product that you care and you like. But think about like international markets. You can translate with the AI.
True.
In Spanish, you can translate it in German, in Italian, in Portuguese, and you can reach that specific audience in their own language. I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about programmatic ads, who would you say is purchasing programmatic advertising?
Everyone. We're talking about brands that are famous, you know, in the travel industry, fast food industry, in the insurance industry. Everyone is looking for audience. And so, you know, any type of brands are buying programmatically. Sometimes they buy as a run of network. So they kind of buy a generic buys that goes, you know, on a geolocation on a territory. But sometimes those buys are very specific and they are looking at specific categories or specific audience. So it gives brands of all sizes a very cool tool to reach their audience.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I like best,
at scale.
Right. That's exactly what I was just going to say. Yeah. That's what I like best about programmatic advertising is that you have this ability to scale, right? Yep. Whereas with host-read ads, there's a lot of power in them, but you have to really go out and individually choose the podcast that you're working with. You have to do the product sampling, and it's just a longer process. There's a level of work involved.
We can hold both at the same time without any problems. For certain podcasters and for certain publishers, it's easy to sell host-read. For others, especially for the independent that just started, they don't have the numbers for that. But it's very important to create that virtuous cycle that is bringing them some revenue that will get the appetite and the encouragement to actually become better podcasters with better tools, with better, microphones, equipment, and then the audience will appreciate it and the audience will actually grow.
Right. I think the other thing that is so important about programmatic that I don't think we talk about enough is the way that I view podcasting is that we have all of these millions, if not maybe even billions, I guess, of impressions, right?
Oh my goodness, billions.
Billions. Okay.
Billions
Billions of impressions. And as a host read, we have very little control over filling that inventory. And the reason is because we are buying the ad before we know what's actually going to be available to be purchased, right? And so when we start out the month and we say, hey, we think we can buy, X number of impressions. Well, what happens if there's 25, % more impressions available? Those can never be filled manually. They have to be filled programmatically. And that when we look at growing the industry, I feel like that's the piece that's so vital.
Absolutely.
is that piece. Now,
no one sells 100%.
No.
Even in the best way, no one sells 100%. And I think that the beauty of this business is that we can definitely hold multiple monetization strategies at the same time.
Absolutely. And I think that that's key, especially to getting closer to 100%, right?
Absolutely.
I wonder if anyone has ever calculated what percentage of impressions are actually filled.
Well, we do. We do calculate all the time for programmatic.
Shows,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We do. It depends. There's no correct number. During the very high season, like Q3, Q4, our fill rate goes up to 95, 98%.
Really?
Yeah. So because there's so much interest in brands in advertising, and they have to offload all their budgets, and it's easy to get to that point. But then in other seasons, there's definitely low and or lower, and
it's just an ebb and flow.
Ebb and flow. Yes, correct.
One of the things about programmatic advertising is that in the past, there typically was hey, this is the demo I'm looking to reach. I'm going to give you my money, place the ads, and I hope that I like where they land.
Yep.
But there is a level of transparency that I think is being demanded in programmatic. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So transparency is very important. It's very important because you want to know where your ad is running on. We have the technology to present that information. And I think that every single player in this ecosystem needs to actually play the transparency card for everyone, because that will get brands very comfortable. Will get publishers very comfortable and say, yeah, this ad ran on my show. And the audience will also, be gratified by the fact that this transparency creates a scalable and trustworthy ecosystem.
Right. I have heard that deduplication is really important as well, right? So because we've got programmatic ad buying coming in from a variety of channels, we want to make sure that the same advertiser isn't running ads on the exact same podcast, just buying them through different outlets.
Correct.
And so that transparency is really key there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So as we think about developments in technology, I think that piece is really crucial to advancing the industry. I'm curious, what are some of the technology advancements that you at Spreaker have been able to implement?
So there's one that I'm very excited about because it creates, again, a trustworthy ecosystem. So when buyers are buying ads on any type of inventory or catalog, they add a tag that is an IAB category. That IAB category can be defining what the ad is about: politics, gardening, fast food, food and beverages, etc. Sometimes that IAB category is incorrect. Why? Because the media buyer didn't put it in, they miscategorize. There's many reasons why that ad comes with an incorrect IAB category. So what we've done at Spreaker, we actually using an AI or machine learning process to actually transcribe all the ads, identify if the IAB category is correctly assigned or even assigned to that specific ad. And then outliers will be sent to a person that will verify that the IAB category and the ad is aligned. We call this system Magda. Magda is the process and the algorithm, but is also Magda, one of our editors, who is overseeing that process. And so we wanted to actually, celebrate her work by naming the process itself and the algorithm as Magda.
And she's got a cool name.
Oh, absolutely.
That makes it even easier, right?
But this is very important. It's very, very important. there's been a lot of complaints from podcasters approaching programmatic around the fact that they were blocked in politics, but the ad came in as gardening, but it was really a political ad.
Right.
And that's frustrating.
It's very frustrating.
And we don't want to have that.
Right. And I think that when we think about it from a podcaster perspective, one of the big concerns with podcasters is that they are afraid really of programmatic ads because they're afraid that they're going to get weird ads that are placed in their podcasts that they don't want. And, you know, I mean, gosh, we struggle with this at True Native Media on a pretty ongoing basis, right? Where it's like, you know, podcasters obviously have strong beliefs about certain things. And when you've got an ad that's being run for an opposing topic, that really sucks, right? That's not at all what they want. And it makes it really difficult. So that's really terrific. I'm glad to hear that you guys are doing that. I mean, that I think the level of transparency coupled with your ability to really put these safeguards in place, that goes a long way to creating a better programmatic kind of ecosphere.
If we want to scale this business, everyone needs to be comfortable.
Absolutely.
If we're not comfortable, this doesn't scale.
Right. No, absolutely. What are some other needs that you see in the industry that maybe we're lacking?
Good question. I think one thing that we see from a publisher point of view is a little bit of lack of information from lack of transparency from the agencies and from the buyers. Like as a publisher, we just get an impression, but we don't know how that impression came, what was the attribution? What was the measurement? Was the campaign successful or not? And I think fostering more communication between the supply and the demand when it comes down to achieving the same goal from a brand is like, I want an ROI that is higher and I want to have clients, your audience becoming my clients. Having that conversation, even with a publisher, I think will be very, very helpful. And at the moment, it's very case by case basis.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that that's a real challenge.
And there's, confidentiality and there's a lot of that. But I think that more information about how a campaign was successful or not will help the publisher also help the brand make it more successful.
I mean, I understand that advertisers don't want to share all of their information, but I totally agree. And I think one of the things we hear from our podcasters over and over is, what does success look like?
Exactly.
So if you're telling me I have to get to this finish line, but you're not telling me where that finish line is, how do I know where I'm at in relation to it? Right. And
correct.
Why advertisers don't understand that, I think, is difficult, right? Because if I can go to a podcaster and say, you need to have this many conversions in order to be, a successful show and want a renewal from that advertiser, then they're going to say, okay, well, where are we at and how can we get there?
Absolutely.
And I'm not really sure what the hesitation is on the side of the advertiser. My thoughts have always been that they didn't want to share that information because they were afraid of showing you how successful they actually were. And I don't know if that's what it is or not, but
it's both ways. If it's successful or not successful. I mean, if it's not successful, you don't have a renewal. That's pretty much.
Right.
But even understanding more information about how the campaign ran, I think it's something that needs to be with all the confidentiality clauses and the safeguard to make sure that your competitor are not listening in. But some of that information needs to be transferred.
Yeah, I agree. I know I've talked to some companies out there where they're able to kind of grade ad reads. Unfortunately, they aren't necessarily grading it on the content of the ad. They're grading it on other things. But I have felt like if we could set up a system where we could grade the ad and where we could say, oh yeah, because we know the performance of a campaign is hinging greatly on how good the ad read is.
Yeah.
So if we could go in and grade those ad reads and say, like, this was an A+ ad read and it performed really well. This was a D+ ad read,
Those two pieces of information, they need to match. They need to kind of get together. And I don't think we're there yet.
No, I don't. But I keep thinking that AI is going to solve that problem for us. So we'll just wait a couple years.
I'm very confident.
Maybe not even a couple years. Maybe a couple months.
Way less.
Crazy. Well, Mattia, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I appreciate you being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I am here at South by Southwest with Shweta and Lindsey from Tinuiti. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
So can you tell us a little bit about Tinuiti?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Lindsey. Hello. So Tinuiti is a full service media agency. So we service clients of a multitude of different solutions, whether that be digital and programmatic, paid social, paid search, retail commerce efforts, influencer marketing plays, paid search across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, basically full funnel. Anything you want to do, you can reach out to us.
Yeah. What I love so much about Tinuiti, and I've had Shasta Nelson on my program before, and it's just so great that you do almost like end to end and that you are a full service agency, because there is so much power, I think, in looking at the entire plan and not just looking at one piece. Do you feel like that has been an advantage of your agency?
Definitely. I feel like because we're able to do everything in-house, I feel like clients are at benefit and advantage when they kind of reach out to us, and we just have to reach out to a different team or a different rep within our agency instead of the client having to go to someone else, some other agency for that matter. So I think having all the solutions in-house has definitely been great and very advantageous for us in the industry as well as a whole. So, yeah.
Yeah, it really allows us to be like super, curated when it comes to clients too, and really tailor media strategies from a complementary solution-based perspective. So, we're not just siloed in thinking of one solution channel being like just programmatic only. We'll work very closely across divisions and across solutions types to have that full funnel approach. So yeah, exactly. It makes us very well-rounded when it comes to planning media and looking at the holistic picture of clients' goals and tailoring strategies that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what do you feel like are the real the powerful elements of podcast advertising?
So in a way, like what appeals to you, right? So I feel like it's such a genius way to kind of get in front of your audiences, building that credibility and trust as well. And I feel like it's such a diverse full funnel channel as well. And in that way, you're able to kind of reach that upper and mid funnel consideration bucket, especially if you want to build that intent for your audiences, having a host kind of read your advertisement, quote unquote advertisement. It's just a great way to kind of get that host as an influencer for your campaign. And I feel like through this way, you're able to kind of also reach that diverse audience and also have that diverse storytelling in that way. So overall, I feel like that has been the main thing, reaching out to these hosts and having them as your influencers.
Yeah. I love it when people say influencers.
Yeah. I also think what is so powerful too is as digital marketers, sometimes we're so focused on screen watch time and viewership metrics of screens. And I think what's cool about podcasts is that it's actually a way too to, advertise users off screens where someone doesn't necessarily need to be on their phone. So, someone could be doing chores around the house and listening to a podcast. And that means they're also listening to podcast ads too that happen there. So I think, the off-screen play piece, and then also that avenue of creativity too, where you can really tailor an ad to fit in with the content of the show too. So a lot of times when we think about podcast advertising, where are we running on? What's the messaging of the podcast show? Like this, for example, how are we going to tailor the way we're speaking to the audience? It's going to fit within the content as well. So I think that creativity there is powerful. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I have had so many conversations today about where in the funnel podcast advertising kind of lies. And so it's interesting that you bring up like where we are in the funnel. So I know that you said like upper and mid tier. And I know I was speaking with someone who did a lot of radio advertising earlier, and they were like, it's definitely lower funnel because radio is so much better at upper funnel, in terms of like overall reach. So do you feel like it is really a full funnel medium?
I do, because sometimes when the client is kind of looking for sales impact, we are able to kind of directly or either indirectly kind of correlate that back based on our proprietary measurement suite, because we are able to kind of place pixels. Like, you must be familiar that we're able to place pixels on some of the podcasts, and we're able to get that measurement back. So I feel like, yes, it can also be used as a lower funnel, but the reason I kind of said, let's use it more like an upper and mid funnel, more like an intent, because sometimes you never know. Maybe your podcast may not drive that conversion or the sale.
Right.
So why should I, put myself at that jeopardy with the client and not get that sales when there are other channels that are better at driving their revenue or their sales volume or the ROI for them.
Right.
But I feel like having it more intent based is better. And then having sales as like a secondary KPI for that matter. Like that's how I would personally plan out that campaign. I would still have sales as my KPI, but I wouldn't put it as like, yes, client A, I'm going to get you a $2 ROI on this, for example.
Right. Okay, I love it. So if you're purchasing podcast ads, are you using it instead of another vehicle, or are you using it in addition to other vehicles?
Yeah, so we kind of look at it as complementary to our existing paid media efforts, because we feel like we don't really want to buy podcasts in a vacuum on its own. We kind of want to have it complement with your overall strategy, and whichever is driving that campaign or client goal, you want to put your budget towards that more. And that's why, we want to kind of put it that way. And specific for podcast strategy, I feel like we kind of tend to do more of like a mix of post rates and also a mix of run of network, either direct or programmatic buys. So what happens in this way, you're kind of taking that portfolio approach instead of transacting it only one way, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. You're kind of taking like that portfolio approach in this way.
Right.
Yeah, definitely complementary in that way too. And I think the way we think about it as well is when there's room for sort of this like teeter-totter effect that we see when it comes to CPM efficiency. So maybe one arm of our campaign is this really like highly scalable run of network streaming campaign that can include other aspects outside of streaming audio. Maybe it's OLV and OTT too. Really highly super scalable, low efficient. These low rates, we're able to complement that where maybe there's room for us to spend a little bit more on a pricier podcast. So that's the way we also see it complementary too, when we're able to, have efficiencies gained elsewhere, where we're able to compromise a little bit and run on something that's maybe more high profile with a strong influencer approach there. So yeah, I would say, when we're able to balance efficiencies that way, because there's something to be said about that authentic impact, where sometimes it really makes sense to splurge a little bit, and spend a little bit more when it's gonna gain to that higher reach and return on investment that way. So
honestly, especially when the client is like, I want to work with this specific host. And then you're like, hey, the CPM is way higher than what I can get.
Right.
And you're like, okay, how do I balance it out without telling the client the CPMs are going to go through the roof? So I think it's a great way, like to what Lindsey said, just balancing out the CPMs.
Yeah.
Right. And also too, like how you were at question about, are we using that instead of or in addition to, because of that point earlier about being off screen too, it adds that added layer of reach in a hard to reach place sometimes. I think sometimes when we think about podcast advertising, especially host reads, we're able to reach users that are listening when maybe in an ad supported or a premium subscription based platform where, premium subscription based users can be hard to reach. So it's thinking about that extra moment that we're able to have too.
Yeah. No, and I love that approach that you aren't necessarily just taking one even podcast ad buying strategy, that you're looking at it across the board. I also know that Shasta had mentioned when I had her on the show that you have seen results in other mediums where, like, I want to say she said streaming video performed better when you partnered it with podcasts. And for me, ever since she said that, and, I'm sure listeners of this show are like, oh my gosh, Heather, can you please stop talking about this? But I just think it's so powerful, because I feel like what we do is we say, like, how is podcast working, right? So like we put podcast in this like little box and we're like, is podcast working or is it not working? Well, it really should never be looked at just in one little piece, right? Like we have to look at the overall campaign. And I also think it's just so important with podcasts because it's an audio format. It's not as actionable as maybe like an Instagram ad is, or maybe something else where if you are watching video, it's easy for you to pull up something on your computer while you're watching video. And with audio, people tend to be moving around. They're not just sitting in one place. And so really looking at that overall marketing mix and then how your campaign is performing overall, I think is really important. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, 100%. So remember to the point that I said, looking at sales indirectly or directly. So yes, we have seen when we kind of pair our OTT campaign with our podcast campaign or a streaming audio campaign, it kind of does better. You get a better response rate because you're kind of already reaching out. This viewer or this listener now has already seen your OTT ad. And now they're being exposed to your podcast ads. So they're when they're walking around their home and you're just listening or whatever they're doing, they're just listening to the podcast. They're definitely in that sentiment that, oh, I remember seeing this ad or, this like video somewhere.
Or maybe they hadn't seen your ad yet even too.
Yeah.
But then when they do, it's visualized and brought to life by that brand narrative and that authentic impact you've had from that host or person talking about it. So you've kind of in the opposite of too, it could work that way too, where like, you've got that trusted messaging out there, but then you're seeing it come to life.
And also kind of to that point, kind of complementing that sight and sound together.
Yes.
It's really driven really strong performance. And we have seen a lot more conversions come through because people who are exposed to a streaming audio or a streaming video ad, they have kind of gone through, complemented each other and like done better in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you define success in a campaign? And I know we just talked about the power of your overall campaign, but when you're looking at podcast advertising, how do you define success?
Definitely sales, but also intent.
That's the best. Yes.
Sales and intent.
Sales and intent.
And we also kind of tell the clients, hey, let's run with video and audio together. And then let's see, based on like the incrementality testing that we have in-house, or the conversion reporting that we have in-house, that we're able to kind of pull, looking at different cross-device graphs and everything. So based on all of these different reporting that our teams are able to pull, our analytics team is able to pull, we're able to kind of look at the correlation on sales or even intent and how that kind of goes up. And I think clients love to see that because it's been such a hard way to measure. It's so hard to measure in that way. So I feel like when the clients are given this kind of measurement pieces or reporting, they're excited. I would be excited too, honestly, if I was a client.
I guess too, because on the topic of defining success and then how we're tracking results too. I mean, we do take multiple points into consideration too when we're storytelling like success of audio advertising. Shweta kind of touched on this a little bit ago, but Tinuiti has our proprietary measurement suite solution too. It includes both econometric modeling and that one-to-one device attribution too. So, device graphs, looking at cross-media use cases where we can report on that upper, mid, lower funnel, see that full picture that's coming from other campaigns in addition to audio campaigns too. So we'll rely like heavily on in-house solutions, but I think it's also important to look at third-party and partner-based solutions too. So what are we seeing from their end as well? Looking at things like promo codes or post-purchase surveys and brand impact from that load too. So.
Yeah. No, that's
I think to add to that, that post-purchase survey and all of those pieces or discount codes. Sometimes I've also feel like you have to keep changing it or, just be on top of it because your podcast might be outdated for that matter, or your advertisement could be outdated. So for example, if you were the host and I tell you, hey, there's a 25% discount code, the listener could go on my site or the client's site and say, there's no 25% discount code. So sometimes I think you have to be sensitive to these things because the podcast is always going to live on a streaming service, right? Or somewhere on a website. So you have to be cognizant of these pieces as well. And I think that's something that we tell our clients, or I tell my clients specifically, just be careful about these, like the narrative that you're sharing. So we typically like to include a link in that description so that was easier for them to go on and, having that call to action early on in your advertisement. Because sometimes these days, especially, there's so many ads out there. There's so many places you can advertise on. I feel like people are tired of ads. Sometimes I get tired of ads,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You get tired of ads? You don't love ads?
I don't get tired of the good ones. The bad ones, definitely.
There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I feel like, having that call to action early on kind of really has a better impact overall.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I think is so important for us always to think about with advertising is we all buy products and services, right? Like if you have a need for a product or service and you hear an ad for it, you're going to listen and you might buy the product, right? But if you hear an ad where you're like, oh, I'm not interested in that, or that doesn't fit my lifestyle or where I'm at, in my life, then you're just going to, so it has to be that combination, and that is all about targeting correctly.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure. So in terms of challenges, do you feel like there are specific challenges that you faced with podcast advertising?
Yeah, I would say honestly, these days with the increased adoption of podcast advertising, probably competition.
Interesting.
Premium show placement can result, in high cost sometimes, You want like kind of that low barrier to entry with high profile access. It can be costly. So kind of just doubling down on that point about being able to compromise when you might have to spend a little bit more but how we'll balance out with your, overall efficient strategy. So yeah, I would say competition, and above all too, the recipe of balancing like a number of things. So I think, first, like I was just saying, cost efficient media with high reach, but then two, audience suitability and content alignment too. So like, what are you saying and who are you speaking to and where are you speaking to them on? Like what is the content of the podcast and how is your messaging going to, resonate there, or is it a poor fit and is it going to come off like really out of place? So, audience suitability and alignment. I think too, like influence factors, like we were talking about that authenticity that podcast hosts can have and how that aligns with brand values. And then I think what becomes tricky is taking all of that and wrapping it up with a bow and saying, hey, you have some positive ROI here,
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think what is so challenging too is that it's difficult. I hate to even hear these words come out of my mouth, but it is difficult to scale, right? Because it's like when you're looking for that alignment, you can say, oh, I've got that alignment here on like these 5 shows or these even 100 shows. But then what happens when the advertiser is like, okay, now give me 100 more. Right. And then, I mean, just the work of finding that. I'm curious when you look at that, just competitive piece of trying to get ads placed in the bigger shows, are you doing any sort of like lookalike audiences? Like, yes, like maybe everybody wants to be on these, top 100 shows or something, but are you able to say, oh, well, actually these other 100 shows really have a lot to offer. They're really similar. They're half the CPM. Like, how do you guys deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say too, like if there's a case where we weren't able to have, proactive insertion in a really high profile show, but we need to reach that same user elsewhere, definitely looking at user base and where we could be in a more, scalable podcast everywhere type of targeting where we're running across one of network, but it's the same user base. So I think lookalikes is a strong way to get there. Audience matching for sure. If it's not, the exact content show we were hoping to be on, is it similar and is the user still watching it elsewhere too? So definitely. Yeah.
And to that point, I think earlier I mentioned as well, trying to run with a mix of all of these different programmatic buys and direct buys. So I think just letting the clients know that, hey, even though this host does not have a strong social media following, you never know. Let's not rely on that. They may be small. They may be starting out. So let's try and reach this diverse audience.
Right.
You never know where someone is listening and, trying to get your audiences, build that audience network over.
Yeah. On the lookalike topic too, I think that there's something to be said about in general lookalike targeting and thinking you need to be in one certain show, but then not realizing, like kind of like Shweta, to your point, what else are people listening to that isn't so obvious?
Yeah.
Right.
And how you can be there, even if it's unintentioned, and, have the same success. So,
right.
Yeah.
I think I couldn't agree with that more. And one of the things that I see that I wish I could convey better to advertisers sometimes is that we get so matchy. So it's like we think, oh, we're this kind of product, like we're vitamins, we can only be on health podcasts. And it's like, yes, I'm not saying you shouldn't be on a health podcast, but like true crime could be a really strong fit for you because we're reaching a lot of middle-aged or, women, middle-aged and younger women.
Right.
So I feel like it's really about the audience. And yes, like targeting contextually is valuable, but like looking at the target demo, I think is just as important.
Absolutely.
That's essentially the bread and butter of programmatic, reaching out to your audience.
Yes, you're right.
Instead of, being on a specific site or publisher, you're trying to reach your audience. Your audience could be reading true crime.
Right.
For that matter.
Yes.
Instead of, it being being on finance site for a financial services client, for example.
Yeah.
So that was a great point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like advertisers want to be on those high profile shows as a status thing, or do you think that it comes down to results?
I think it depends. I think there's a lever of influence though that does come from the high profile shows, of course. If it's a, an A or B or C list celebrity, even that, is going to carry that brand trust and brand equity messaging. But again, going back to like where you can see efficiencies elsewhere, if your goal is backing into CPM or you need wide reach, and most impressions you could get where, you're okay with running on maybe what's not the most obvious, glamorous type of show, you're still going to get the same result.
And I think clients also like the brand safety aspect.
Yeah.
Because they know that host. They know who's listening to it.
Right.
They know the content. Like
It's
they
safe,
may personally be listening to it. So I think the brand safety aspect also comes in because that is still limited.
True.
In how we are kind of targeting.
Yeah.
What if I recommended a bunch of lookalikes and maybe the brand is aligned with something that they don't want to be aligned with?
Right.
So I think that's something that they also want to go after, or they're like looking for high place.
Yeah. Have you used any of the brand safety tools on the market, and has that been helpful if you have?
So I feel like if you run programmatically, you're definitely able to apply it.
Yeah.
But it's still, I have trust issues personally. So even if I have like a brand safety partner apply, I feel like things might slip through the cracks. And I don't know because, well, if you remember, like when programmatic was first new in the market, right, in the industry, I was told that, hey, you're going to get 99% at like fraud-free environment. Mm-hmm. But then I have so many sites that I'm running on and I'm like, why am I on this site? XYZ partner.
Right.
So I think over time, because Programmatic got a lot of traction, so I think with that, we were able to come up with solutions. So I feel like with podcasts as well, even if I apply brand safety right now and maybe it falls through the cracks, I think over time, because it's getting more popularity and more traction, I think we'll come up with solutions as a whole. As an industry, we'll come up with solutions.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for growth too, and taking like brand safety and ad verification, into mind, but also thinking about how we can optimize towards things like user listening patterns, like more granularly too, and how that plays in. It's going to be huge, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like there's anything missing from the podcast industry?
Yeah, so like I was saying before, for the programmatic strong folks or who started in programmatic, I feel like frequency capping or ad authenticity, brand safety, I feel like these are some things that are still missing or limited in this role. And again, like with the more traction that podcast is getting, I think it's going to be much more easier to build solutions around it, as how we saw programmatic over the last even decade.
Yeah.
There's so many different partners who are doing pixel tracking or brand safety. Like new partners are coming up or popping up every single time. So I feel like there's definitely room. But right now, I feel like even if I use a certain DSP to run podcasts or audio, I feel like a lot of the AI partners are not able to be applied on these campaigns to optimize to a certain metric. So we really have to rely on like the algorithm and just that reach that we're getting. Also, attention, that's a new metric that I feel like no one's really talking about. And I feel like over time, I don't even know if I can trust the attention metric that if I can even put it on my campaigns. Right? So I think over time, there's definitely going to be more things that will come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What would make your agency double down on podcast advertising? Is there anything that you think, and I know we were just talking about like the gaps and things, but what do you guys feel like would be something that would make you want to invest more heavily in this?
Yeah, I would say like any ability to continue maximizing that low barrier access to high profile content, of course. And I think just bringing up what we were speaking on a moment ago too, enhanced ability to, optimize. Also, like the rise of algorithmic custom bidding products has really refined our attention on incrementality methods over the years. So finding any ways at all that we can prove incrementality, especially when we're talking about sales and return on investment. So I think that would go a long way in this area. It'd make audio streaming really highly sought after if we can continue to use some of these AI-based optimization partners to prove out that incrementality and refine our granular targeting there too, to see where we're like directly getting lift and how that ties into user listening patterns too. So in tandem, like how we can better refine our targeting strategy contextually or behaviorally based on some of those, incremental results.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate your feedback and all of your knowledge. And I love all of your ideas. Definitely going to take them to the industry and say, hey guys, if we want more, this is what we need. So thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having both of us.
Yes.
It was a pleasure meeting you. And I really hope that, listening to us, maybe someone is out there kind of thinking of a solution for some of the challenges that we're kind of running into. So
I'm glad we got about podcast advertising on a podcast. So
I know. So fun. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.